You are on the cutting edge with Dr. Lee Pierson, Dr. Robert Stubblefield, and Dr. Ray Shelton, our continued uh, guest, and Steve Richins, myself. And we are continuing on the adventures in the Anteroom. And we're going to try to get to volition today. And with that, Lee, take over.
Oh, okay. I actually do have a couple of things, a couple of points from last week that I want to emphasize, points that are distinct from the points made in the chapter. And of course, that's what we're trying to get at here in Cutting Edge, just to go beyond what's already been points that have already been made. So I have two in particular that I just want to summarize, and then we can go. We're going to continue in the chapter. We're going to try to move a little faster here maybe and skip a few things here and there so we can get to volition, everybody's favorite, well, my favorite topic in the world anyway. I don't know about the rest of you guys. So anyway, a couple of things. Point one, regarding last week. Form of perception, in my view, is actually form of sensation. It's the form in which we don't perceive the world. It's not the form in which we do, it's the form in which we don't perceive the world. That is, we don't perceive coins as elliptical, we don't perceive straight sticks as bent, we don't perceive faraway people as small, we don't perceive envelopes on slightly tilted as trapezoidal, but we do have sensory experiences of those things that you could call form of sensation. Okay, the related point is that illusions, or at least some illusions, maybe all, maybe not, but illusions are based on sensory phenomena, not perceptual phenomena. Illusions are confusions of form of sensation, confusions of form with object, form of sensation with objects of perception. And these occur in part because these experiences, normally when we have these experiences, they're all mixed together. You open your eyes and you perceive the world, but you also have all these sensory experiences of blobs of color and shifting shapes and variation. Roughly speaking, the invariants in your experience are the perceived elements, and the variants in your experience are the sensory elements, at least as a rough first categorization. So the sensory experiences, the sensory qualities that I'm calling form of sensation, are basically momentary snapshot experiences from a particular point of view. So when you're looking at that coin at a coin for a moment, it may look elliptical to you, but when you walk around it, or even move it a little bit, or feel it in your hand and rub it around, you'll get the perception of it being what it is. The way you perceive things is the way they are, as round. You don't perceive it as elliptical. You don't perceive with this, the old bent stick, the favorite object of
Whipping
philosophers.
illusion.
Yeah, I was thinking of beating, but I couldn't quite think of the right way to bring that in. Anyway, so you have the stick. It's in the water. It looks bent, but I don't think that's a perception. I wouldn't call it as a sensory experience. And the way you deal with that and disambiguate it, if that's the right term, is by perceptual activity. Not by thinking in particular, but by perceptual activity. You go to the stick. One thing you can do is pull it out of the water. Another thing you can do is twirl it in the water. You'll see that it doesn't behave like a straight stick. Sorry, a bent stick would behave. You have to keep track of these sticks. It doesn't behave the way a bent stick would behave if it were twirled, or even just walking around it. You'll get information um, which tells you. I know the philosophers don't like that term, which gives you information that it's not a bent stick. So the way you deal with these kind of problems is perception, which is an activity, an action over time of picking up invariants from this structure of the stimulation, rather than just settling for a quick snapshot from a particular point of view, which is what the sensory qualities are. Okay, with that, unless somebody wants, Bob may want to comment on that. Nope, he's not going to jump in at this point. Uh, we'll just go over to page 44, which is roughly where we are. and start talking about some of the material here and see if we can keep moving. There's a paragraph there. It says page 44 on my version, which is the Kindle. This is the second paragraph, but different. Sometimes when you reopen the Kindle on a certain place, it's slightly different. The positioning is slightly different. But anyway, the paragraph that starts, Ayn Rand's answer is, we can distinguish form from object. She says, but this does not imply the subjectivity of form or the invalidity of the senses. Now, I'm certainly in agreement with that, but I think it's simpler than Dr. Peikoff may think here, because it's a simpler issue, because it's, in my view, it's form of sensation, which is, can be readily distinguished from perception, even without science. Now, he says, Dr. Peikoff here in the next paragraph says, the task of identifying the nature of physical objects as they are apart from man's form of perception does not belong to philosophy, but to physics. Now, I would take issue with this. I don't know whether I'd call it as belonging to philosophy. Ordinary people, as I see objects as they are. Perception is of objects as they are. We don't perceive objects as they are perceived. We don't perceive objects as they are. We don't perceive our perceptions. We perceive the objects. Now, that can be interfered with, because mixed in with that perceptual experience are these sensory quality experiences, which can be confused. You can confuse those. Certainly philosophers do it. Why can't ordinary people do it? You can confuse you might think for a second that the railroad tracks meet. I know Ray would never do that, but some people would think for a second maybe, or that a person far away is a small person. Hermann von Helmholtz claimed that he thought that as a child, but who knows? But you certainly can you might, I'm searching for the right word, because think is not exactly the right word. See, the bent stick in water looks like a bent stick. The Mueller-Lyer illusion, where objects will look of the same length, they're close to the same length, may look different lengths. It's one way. They look different lengths. And by the way, they look different lengths to parrots and to monkeys and to some other animals. So this is not particularly a conceptual phenomenon. The phenomenon of illusion is not particularly a conceptual phenomenon. Illusions
And
are based on...
A
Yes, sir.
picture is unnatural information too. There are no invariants in the background. So on the Mueller-Lyer,
Yes.
you have this isolated symbolism, if I call it a symbol. But anyway,
Well, it's a frozen perspective on paper. You're looking at something from a particular perspective. And normally in the world, when you'd see something like the eaves of a roof, which might be similar to the Mueller-Lyer illusion, if you're looking at something like that, when you walk around, things move, and there's variation from which you can extract invariance. But the illusion, and this is all the geometrical illusions that the Gestalt psychologists studied that are on paper, they represent basically frozen perspectives. You can't walk around it and get more information. So you can't do much about it that way. So that's right, Steve. I agree with what you're saying there. Okay, so then Dr. Peikoff says, there is no philosophic method of discovering the fundamental attributes of matter. Now that, to me, sounds right. Whatever the fundamental attributes of matter are, that is indeed a matter for physics, I suppose. And, who knows when we'll get to, how do you know? You keep unwrapping the onion and you find that there are molecules and there are atoms, and then there are elementary particles like protons and neutrons and electrons, and then there are quarks, and I don't know if they've gone a whole lot further, but they've discovered a whole zoo of elementary particles, and who knows where that might end. And that indeed is well beyond what normal perception does by itself. It's based on perception, of course, but it's perception. So that's true. You can't discover the fundamental attributes. But there are other things that have perfectly independent existence besides the fundamental attributes of matter. There are attributes that exist of themselves independently from consciousness, having nothing to do with form whatsoever, but are not fundamental attributes of matter. And I don't see that Dr. Peikoff is recognizing that. I have in mind, for example, the flatness of a table. A table is flat, and that has nothing to do with form or perception. It's flat. It means that it's a objective is the wrong word. It's so hard to get the right language for these things. It's an independently existing attribute of some entities that is flat, which means you can put something on it and it won't slide off if it's horizontal. It's solid, which means you put something on it, it doesn't go through. It has a certain shape. Objects have shape. Shape is not a feature of, not imposed on it in any way by your sensory qualities. It's an independently existing feature. Weight, those are attributes of the thing, independent of any awareness. If you had a honeybee's form of visual perception, you would still perceive these same attributes. It has nothing to do; those have nothing to do with form of awareness, as far as I can see. So when Dr. Peikoff says, uh, shape may not be a primary, but merely an effect of the underlying things, which he talks about. He has this imaginary experiment of puffs, meta puffs, as the elementary particles. But whatever they are, if it's an effect, it still is real. And it's not an effect of consciousness. It's not that consciousness has that effect or that our means of perception has an effect. Perception is detection. And Dr. Peikoff frequently uses the word interaction in here. And I don't think perception is really an interaction. The world acts on you in perception. You act on the world only in the sense of doing things like moving around it or moving the objects or feeling them in that sense. But you don't, it's not really an interaction in the strict sense of the term. Perception is detection of what's there. And you don't need to, it is not necessary for a detector. This is an important point regarding, let me just make the point. It is not necessary for a detector to impose its nature on what it's detecting, unless we're talking about quantum physics, and let's not do that. Unless somebody really wants to get into that level, and even there, well, there's a lot of questions, but let's not worry about that. That's a micro level phenomenon, if it's anything. Generally speaking, a detector like a Geiger counter or a thermometer or a barometer or any of those sorts of, I like to use the polar planimeter, which was brought up as one psychologist as an analogy to perception. A device that actually registers area when you use it on a map. Anyway, those things detect. They don't construct anything. They don't take sensations in and make something out of them. They just simply detect what's there, and they do not impose their own nature on it in any detectable in any detectable way. And so there's no problem from that standpoint of perception being changing your awareness, that your means of perception changes the nature of your awareness. Not necessary. All right, so let me see. Let me go see if I can move on a little. Yeah, okay, man's conscious. Oops. All right, I'm gonna move. I've kind of made points that are relevant to the next couple of pages, so I'm gonna move on from there a little bit.
To page what,
Uh,
please?
let's see here. Well, at least gotta make sure this thing. Page 45. I haven't got that far. Okay, page 45. Form of grasping the object. I will go on to page 46, let's say. Well, I've already made that. See, okay, so this is page, oops, page 46, where Dr. Peikoff says, those who condemn the senses as deceptive. This is roughly the second or third paragraph on page 46, depending on where your Kindle cuts in. Those who condemn the senses as deceptive on the grounds that sense qualities are merely effects on men are guilty of rewriting reality. I'd say, yeah, that's right. They're deceptive. Sensory qualities, the way I would put it is, though, the sensory qualities can be deceptive when they are mistaken for objects of perception. That's the mistake. Because the sensory qualities, again, I'm operating from the James J. Gibson perspective, don't have anything to do with perception. Well, not directly anyway. Somebody could ask about that if they want to, but they don't have any direct effect on perception. So I don't agree with the interaction idea. Okay, those who condemn the senses on the grounds that sense qualities are different from the primaries that cause them. Now, I'm not doing that because the sense qualities are not part of perception. But he says those people that condemn the senses because of sense qualities are different from the primaries that cause them. He says they demand that the primaries be given to man pure in no sensory form. And the view that perception underlies this kind of demand is the mirror theory. The mirror theory is not the only theory that tells you that you can get perception without a sensory form. There is such a thing as a mirror theory, but J.J. Gibson's theory, which we have alluded to before, is that perception is based on the pickup of information, which is to say structure, in the energy that is sampled by your sense organs. That there's a structure in that energy, and that structure is specific, and it's not that the specific to what you perceive, and it's not that structure is somehow a mirror of the object. It's not even a representation or a model of the object. It is simply specific to the object. So there's an alternative theory to the mirror theory that says you can, well, I don't know that primaries is the right term, that you can perceive attributes of entities pure, not mixed with sensory qualities. Okay, I'm going to go on here. We've talked about looks a little bit. Okay, we can, so then again, this is a similar point on page 47, more or less the beginning of the second paragraph there. Dr. Peikoff says, we can know the content of reality pure, apart from man's perceptual form. Okay, I'm with that. I'm definitely with that. But we can do so only by abstracting away man's perceptual form, only by starting from sensory data, then performing a complex scientific process. No. The complex scientific process, which is, I guess he's talking about physics primarily here, is how we discover what the fundamental elements of reality, that underlie the other elements that cause them, the more fundamental causes. That's how we do that. But that's not to deny the reality of attributes that are caused by the fundamentals. And I've already given examples like solidity, weight,
Size.
flatness, size. Those things are all real. They're not a construction. They're not reality as perceived by us. They're reality, pure and simple. I got Bob thinking at least about it. Okay.
Dr. Pierson, may I
Yes.
ask
Okay, Ray. Dr. Shelton, sir.
a
Yes, Ray.
question?
Oh, by the way, again, let me just say that we've decided we have too many PhDs floating around here. We're gonna go with Ray, Bob, and Lee.
All
That
right.
sounds
We
like a
all have three.
comedy team or something.
We all
Ray,
have
Bob, and Lee. Go ahead.
Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe.
Yes. Yeah, right.
Am I understanding correctly that you are taking Leonard to be applying the concept of form to things such as solidity, flatness, and so forth? That the
That's
concept
correct. That's
that the
correct.
concept of form
Yeah,
applies
go ahead. Sorry.
universally to all of these uh, the examples that you gave, the flatness, that
Size, solidity.
size, solidity,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
he is saying that those are forms of how we perceive that are the result of an interaction.
That's right. I think that's what he says.
Okay.
And I think is that what he's saying is all perception is perception in a form.
Okay.
That's the view.
Okay.
And that's the
And
view I'm taking issue with.
okay.
I'm
So
saying that but when the things that are talked about as form are actually forms of sensation, and no perception is perception in a form of sensation.
okay.
It's
Thank you. That's
not part of
helpful.
perception at all. Yeah. Okay. Uh, if we go on, we will hit here soon. I hope we'll get around to the definition of perception, and that will enable us to deepen this discussion a bit. Um, there's something called naive realism, which I've never been quite sure what people exactly mean. Maybe I'm a naive realist. I'm certainly a direct realist. There's a real world out there, and we perceive that world. And we don't perceive that world as we perceive it. We perceive the actual existing world with its actual existing real attributes. That's what real direct realism. Now, I know Ayn Rand definitely is in the camp of direct realism, but the perception theory we've been discussing doesn't really support it, because you end up with this, your awareness is object as perceived, which includes these formal aspects. And Gibson separates them. There's senses considered as perceptual systems. That's the systems, that's the processes that detect the world, what's out there in the world, that's perception. And there's the senses considered as channels of sensation, which is something altogether. That's the source of form of sensation, the experiences of color, these momentary sensory experiences, which are hard to describe, by the way. Because all of this stuff is kind of hard to describe. It's all at a kind of very basic, close to axiomatic, if not axiomatic level. It's hard to describe them, but anyway, sensory qualia are things like the feels of things, and including things like color or loudness of a sound, those kinds of things. All right, consciousness has identity. We're still in that same page, which of course is true. But what I'm trying to say is the fact that something has identity doesn't mean it has to impose its nature. If it's a detector's identity, it's because of its identity that it simply detects and does not impose its own nature on what it detects. That's the nature of a detector. And I believe with Gibson that we have evolved a whole system of detectors, perceptual detectors that do precisely that actually detect the way the world is. What Kant said, things in themselves. Now, things in themselves is really an unnecessary, I was about to say an unnecessary redundancy, but that's redundant, right? Saying unnecessary redundancy. So it's redundant. You don't need it. But sometimes it's good, just like laissez-faire capitalism is redundant, but sometimes it's a good thing just to remind people that we do perceive things as they are, not things as they look from a particular perspective as a snapshot for a really short time and in the form of sensory qualities. That's not what perception is about. All right. Moving onward here. Yeah. See, on page 49, Dr. Peikoff says, oh no, he's talking about the skeptics. Well, We don't need to talk more about this, skeptics. We are not skeptics here. We're definitely not skeptics here. Actually, Dr. Peikoff makes more or less the point I just made, which is on page 50. 1, 2, 3, basically the fourth paragraph. Objectivists discard the locution reality as it really is. The phrase is a redundancy. There is no reality as it really isn't. But there are looks to things. I'm not sure whether Ray will buy into this or not, but things do have a look. You can pay attention to that. And it's really one way of putting it is it's a difference between being introspective on what you see and being extrospective. If you're extrospective and you look at the coin, it's round. From a certain reduced introspective point of view, a coin can look oval, or the railroad tracks can look like they meet, or the envelope on an angle can look trapezoidal. But you have to take a certain attitude, which I would describe as introspective. The perceptual attitude is extrospective. And by the way, you can't really introspect on perception. The perceptual activities of the organism are not introspectable. The pickup of information from the structure of light is a non-conscious process that results in your awareness. Steve, by the way, you wouldn't happen to have that diagram with the trees, would you, by any chance?
I can have it momentarily.
All right, go ahead and see, because that might be useful, because we haven't. I'm talking about how perception works by the pickup of information, which is invariance in the stimulation. It's hard to discuss that and describe what those invariants are, but a picture, we have a picture that gives one of my favorite examples, and when Steve finds it, we'll take a look at that. Okay, so objectivists don't speak of things in themselves, which Kantians contrast to things in relation to consciousness. Again, I agree with that, but I think it's important to emphasize that that just like laissez-faire capitalism emphasizes the pure nature of capitalism, things in themselves emphasizes that what we perceive are the things, not the things as they appear as a form. That's not what we perceive. We don't perceive despite some people think we do, by the way. Some objectivists think we do perceive railroad tracks as meeting. We do not. That is a sensory experience that is illusory, or it's the basis of an illusion if you confuse it with the actual perception of the reality of the railroad tracks.
Daniel, can you set sharing for me, please? If you're there. Okay. He says yes. Okay.
So Dr. Peikoff says,
thanks, Daniel.
Man perceives reality directly, not some kind of effects different from it. That's true. He perceives reality by means of its effects in his organs of perception. That's true. It's a little bit passive, that description, because in fact, what a perceiver does is go out. The acquiring information is an activity. An organism moves around and reorients and shifts attention, and those things are important to extracting what's invariant from what varies in the stimulation. It's a much more active process. And I would add that it has a certain element of what I like to call proto-volition. There is a certain element of choice involved when you go out and try to perceive the world. The best example of that, for understanding it from the human point of view anyway, that I know, is the cocktail party phenomenon, where you're in a room with 100 people and there's a cacophony of sound because they're all talking at once. By attention, you can perceive one conversation or one person talking, but it is highly effortful. It takes a significant mental effort of attention, which is the signature of volition. And you have to do that. It does not happen automatically. And that's worth noting. Anyway, that's something of a side note here.
Okay, I'm ready when you need it, Lee.
Okay, let's take a look at let's see what you can do,
Cross your
Steve.
fingers.
Let's oh, there it is. Okay. Now this is a picture. It's got a tree too of a scene. This is obviously a picture drawing, but that line, horizontal line, represents the horizon, and the below the horizon is the surface of support that extends off, to way off into the distance. And here are some telephone poles, and you notice that there's the three telephone poles. The angles they subtend to your eye, which is the be part of your sensory quality experience, you would see are different angles. The one in front is a big angle, and then there's a medium-sized angle, and there's a small angle. However, in the world, you would actually perceive these telephone poles validly, or dare I say, even correctly. Can I use that term? I get criticized for that. Validly, correctly, you perceive these telephone poles as being the same height, even though the visual angles subtended in your sensory qualia are different. How can that be? Well, we don't use the sensory qualia. We don't take that sensory qualia and then by some complicated inference, maybe with triangles and trigonometry or something, geometry, try to calculate uh, the size of those things. Rather, there's direct information in the light itself to your eye that specifies height, and that information, at least one form, and there's more than one form of information for these things. If we had a real surface, there'd be a texture, and that would give us some other information. But anyway, in this situation, the ratio of the part of the telephone pole above the horizon to the part below the horizon. I don't know if he's get a little closer to that telephone pole there with your arrow there. There we go. The part above the horizon, the ratio of that part to the part below the horizon is an invariant. No matter where that telephone pole is, that particular pole, no matter where it is on the surface, whether it's very, very far away or right up next to your eye, it will always have the same. I'm dealing with a flat surface here, by the way. It will always have the same ratio above horizon to below horizon. And if your perceptual system can pick up that information, can extract that invariant, then that would be a basis for seeing those telephone poles as being the same height. They're all the same height based on that information. And notice, if that is the information used by your perceptual system, we're not aware of it. We're not aware. Nobody's aware of that information unless you're a perception psychologist. You're not aware of it. But it functions in your perceptual system does use it to identify, to detect, or can use it. There's some question about exactly which invariants are used and which aren't. That's a scientific question. But anyway, your perceptual system could use this information to detect, not construct, and it has nothing to do with the sensory qualia. It's a feature of the light itself. You don't, by the way, you would not first construct this picture in your mind and then use this picture in your mind's eye and detect the invariance from that. You can detect them directly from the information, from the energy obtained by the eye. If you did it this other way, that would be representationalism. That'd be a wrong theory. So that's the information, and it can tell you definitely that those three telephone poles are the same height. The tree you can see is a bit taller, I think, because it's got a greater ratio. And by the way, of height of above horizon to below. And by the way, there is a 0 point even in this scale, and that is if you have an object, no matter where it is on the surface, but if you have an object that whose top just kisses the horizon line, if you have such an object, that object is precisely at eye level. That's information, kind of an absolute anchoring point for information for height. So anyway, this is just a nice example of how an invariant works, and it has nothing to do with taking sensations, putting them together in some undefined manner, and getting a perception out of them. You can go back now, Steve, if you can.
Can I add
Oh, sure.
Because
Absolutely.
because this is an artificial two-dimensional flat piece
Yes.
of paper, it's only being used here in the context of Gibson. But if you criticize it, if you look at the ground here, it's completely white, and that, if you're snow skiing, is blindness because there's no structure, there's no invariance, there's no texture gradients, so there's
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
information there.
Well,
So
in the surface is no. This is an abstraction, obviously. It is an
right,
abstraction. And we're not focusing here on the invariants of texture, that's a very basic source of information for Gibson, is that any real surface like this would have some kind of texture. And they're often quite regular, or at least, shall we say, stochastically regular. There's at least there may be some level of randomness built in, but there's enough regularity in most textures out there, or many in the world, to provide a whole other source of information. But we don't have that illustrated. We don't have that illustrated in this case.
okay, I'll stop.
Okay,
Thanks, Lee.
can
Thanks.
we go back to the? Yeah, there we go. Okay, so there we are.
Lee, may
Uh,
I?
yes, yes.
I don't want to take us off topic, but I'm curious, do you think that this invariant ratio connects to Ayn's view of consciousness as fundamentally mathematical?
Yes, I do. I actually, this is, as you say, this takes us a little bit ahead, but
Yeah.
I think that when Ayn Rand talks about measurement omission, I suspect, but we'll have to discuss this another time. I think that when she talks about measurement omission, there's a certain similarity to the perceptual process of extracting invariance from variation. You take what's invariant out of what varies, and you take what is constant, or you take a certain constancy out of a variation of things like color in conceptualization. So yeah, I think so, and I gather you do too, maybe.
Well, listening to you talk about how we're extracting information and looking at the length above and below the horizon line. Of course, a ratio is a mathematical comparison.
Absolutely, it's a mathematical, yeah, and
And
invariants in general are mathematical in nature.
right,
Yes.
that's what I was thinking. So
Yep.
I was
Yeah.
just curious if that was one of the points you're making
Yeah. No,
or
that's
what you
good.
thought
That's
it was.
right. That's absolutely right. That's good. And I think again, I think we can even go further with that and develop a parallel between what goes on in perceptual activity and conceptual. But I'm not prepared to develop that parallel today, and plus we've got other things to do. But we'll come back to that. Keep that in mind. We will come back to that. I hope we will. Okay. So we're up to. Let's go up to the perceptual level as the given, which of course is absolutely right. Um, he says, I'm considering sensory awareness as an adult phenomenon, although, in adults, they're, as I say, it's kind of mixed together with the perceptual phenomenon, and that makes it tricky with adults when you're talking about sensory phenomena sometimes. But anyway, there are two stages in man's development: sensation and perception. No, I don't think that. I don't think the science demonstrates that. The old idea of William James, the blooming, buzzing confusion. Uh, my understanding is developmental psychology research has not supported that point of view. A very young infant can track an object visually as it moves, so it's not trapped in some world of pure buzzing, confusing sensation. It certainly can't see the way we do. There's a lot of perceptual learning that it has to do to reach the state that humans have. But it's not. It doesn't start in the blooming, buzzing confusion. At least as far as I'm aware, that's not the case. Okay. Well, anyway, he says human infants start in this state and remain in it, which I don't think is true. But no one reading these worlds suffers such a state now. At least I hope not. Okay, so moving onward. On page 52, the reason you see an entity is that you have experienced many kinds of sensations from similar objects in the past, and your brain is retaining and integrating them. I absolutely, completely disagree with this view, and I don't think it even is coherent because similarity, as Ayn Rand says in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, similarity is grasped perceptually. So this is out of order hierarchically. If you have to refer to similarity to integrate sensations into perception, you're asking it to do something that's a function of perception itself. Yeah, it's a inversion of the hierarchy. You can't have similarity before you have perception, I don't think. So I don't really think this makes any sense. And in any event, there are other problems with it we'll get to when we talk about the definition of perception, which is coming up right here.
Lee, can I interrupt here?
Sure.
I think that's an interesting point that you're making here, because when we look at other neurologically complex animals, such as dolphins, horses, so forth and so on, immediately after they're born, they're in a world of entities. There's no, within moments of being born, they struggle. Well, with dolphins, right away, they're moving. There's no
horses too, right?
There's no integration of anything. They are already moving in a world of entities, and I don't think there's any reason to think that human beings are different in this regard. Biologically, in relationship to other animals, we are born a little bit prematurely, but that has to do with the narrowing of the pelvis due to the fact that we have to walk vertically. But that's another point. Aside from here, I mean, that's why we're born so early, to the shrinking of we couldn't get out of the pelvis. But I don't think there's any reason.
With our big heads, we have big heads.
Yeah, our big heads. So, and I think you're right. The research does show that as soon as we're born, being able to track things and so forth and so on shows that we are very quickly into a world of entities.
Yeah.
Rather than this long process of integrating something into entities. So I think here the connection to animal research and those sorts of things is important.
Yeah. Good. Okay. We got the definition of perception here. So I didn't want to discuss this. A perception in Ayn Rand's definition. Let me stop there for a second. He uses the word perception here, but later in the chapter he uses the word percept. And also Ayn Rand in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, when giving this same definition, uses the word percept. And also you can see here that he talks about a perception. So he's talking about, I think here, a noun, the result of this activity rather than the activity itself. A percept is something. A percept or a perception, a percept is some kind of thing, which is the result of a group of sensations. Well, the definition is a group of sensations automatically retained and integrated by the brain of a living organism, which give it the ability to be aware of not of single stimuli, but of entities of things. Well, what's meant here by a perception? What is that exactly? I'm hoping Bob can give us something because I don't know what this is. If it means the object perceived, what it is that you perceive, what is perceived. If it means what is perceived, we are instantly into representationalism there, because it's saying that what's perceived is an integration of sensations, which is not the world. That is an idealist version, and that would be if you wanted to be a realist, you'd be a representational realist, which objectivism does not want to be. So it can't really refer to that. But what is it? What is it? I think this is not a bad definition for form of sensation. A group of sensations automatically retained and integrated by a brain. I don't know about the retained, but integrated. But not, well, I wouldn't have the last half. Be aware of not single stimuli, but of entities, because it's not the means of that. So I'm not sure that there's anything that this noun perception, I don't know what this noun perception could actually refer to. Anybody want to jump in, Ray or Bob or Steve, as to what this percept, what is the thing, or the actual referent of this thing? It's a thing, it's a noun.
It says right here that what you're aware of is not a sensation, but the entity.
I know, but what's the perception then? I agree with that, of course. You're not aware of the sensation, because I'm saying the sensation's irrelevant. I'm following Gibson, say the sensation's irrelevant. But here, I'm talking about here in this usage, when the word perception or percept, same thing, he uses that word later, and Ayn Rand uses it in ITOE. What is the referent of that word? What does that actually refer to? I can't really come up with anything that makes any real sense, because, as I said, if you put in there, the obvious thing to put in would be what is perceived. Well, that would be instant representationalism. So, you have any ideas there, Bob? What the word perception? What is the referent for that word?
I think the referent is entity. Entity.
Okay, good. An entity is, we should be able to substitute entity for perception in that case. An entity is not a group of sensations automatically retained and integrated by the brain of a living organism. That would turn an entity into a mental phenomenon. It's not. That can't possibly be right under a realist conception of existence, which we all have.
You're confusing science and consciousness now.
I'm taking the word. You just said that a perception is an entity. And I'm saying it can't be an entity under this definition. And I just explained why. Under this definition, it cannot be an entity, cannot be a perception. If we take a realist view, which we all do here, we're all realists. I hope we're all direct realists, Taking that view, it is impossible to say that the perception is an entity. It is not. And has nothing to, this is a scientific definition in general.
The perception is of an entity. What is perceived?
What's a perception? Then you can't say that a perception is an, you just contradicted yourself, because you can't say that a perception is an entity. If it's perception is of an entity, it still leaves me with the question, what is a perception then? What is that? Well, I'll tell you what, let me just...
A perception is the result of consciousness being aware of an entity.
Say that again?
A perception is the result, interaction, if you will, of a consciousness being aware of an entity.
Perception is the result. Well, what is the nature of this? Is it a conscious experience?
Yes.
So we have a conscious experience on this view. That's different than the entity perceived. What are we aware of? Are we aware of this awareness?
It is certainly true that your consciousness of an entity is different from the entity. Your being aware of an entity is not the same thing as the entity.
I'll go with that, I think. We're in a tricky realm here, but yes, I guess we can go with that. Your consciousness and your perception in that sense.
So what Leonard is saying
is
that out there in reality are entities, and in consciousness are perceptions of entities, your awareness of things that are out there in reality. Now, the fact that he gives a scientific explanation where none is necessary is
and where it's incorrect,
irrelevant. But
Well, it does say, let's see, let me see if I can go a little further with this. It does say, which gives it to the ability to be aware. So it's, which gives it, perception gives it. So he's actually saying it's not the awareness itself, the perception. The perception gives it, what's the it here? I hate pronouns. Gives it, the organism, okay. Which gives it, the organism, the ability to be aware not of single stimuli, but of entities of things. Now, if you take that seriously, it's not the awareness, but it is the power of your consciousness, of a perceptual system. And one of the things, this is another thing about the word consciousness. There is a constant going back and forth between faculty and state, and I don't like that. So I think that sometimes causes confusion. But let's see. The perception gives the organism the ability to be aware. I don't know. What does that actually, if you have a perception, you're able to be aware? So he's not actually saying it's the awareness. And I understand why he doesn't want to say that, because as soon as you say it's the awareness, you're into representationalism. If you say it is the awareness and there's something in your mind that is your awareness, then that's different from the thing itself. And I don't see how we can avoid representationalism. And so he's trying to avoid it, but gives it the ability to be aware, which it's something other than the awareness in that case. All right. Anyway, this needs some work. Let's just say maybe we could.
So, Lee, if I
leave it
could
at that for now.
summarize,
Yes.
I could summarize what I think is your
Mhm.
point. That in this definition, perception is really just a power or an ability. In this particular definition, what perception comes down to being is saying it's an ability or a power of consciousness.
Yeah. Well,
in other words,
gives it the ability to be
in other
aware.
words, perception is just a type of awareness.
Well, except that it's the ability to be aware, not the awareness.
Right. Exactly.
So it's a little, and I understand. I see why he's doing that, because that you're on this tightrope. In any event, I did ask him once where did he get this definition from, and of course he said, obvious answer, he got it from Ayn Rand. And then the question is, where did she get it? And we don't know for sure. It has roots in Helmholtz, which Ayn Rand certainly read some Helmholtz, as we know from Art and Cognition. William James has something like this, and there are other early psychologists that have something in this area. The closest to this definition that I know of in the history of human thought that I know of is Immanuel Kant. Because Immanuel Kant says almost the exact same thing. Is that sensations automatically integrated. I don't know if he had the retained part, but that would be consistent. I just don't remember. Integrated, in his case, he said by the mind. See, Ayn Rand says it's integrated by the brain. He says by the mind, and of course, in Kant's case, this is of course a worse formulation, because that requires the mind, which is categories, concepts, to impose the structure. The categorical structure has to be imposed on the sensation, and bam, we're into the two worlds and everything about it. So this is not as bad as that, but still, you are kind of into two worlds. As soon as you have this thing that's an integration of sensations, what is that thing? Is that the object of awareness? What does it mean to say that it makes you able to be aware? I don't know what that means. Um, and in any case, on the Gibson point of view, it's not this is wrong anyway. This is not a correct description. And if the Gibson view is correct, that information is based on sensation, Kant is cut off right there at the knees. He just cut off completely. If it's not sensation, Kant relies on the idea that perception is an integration of sensation in order to separate his two worlds. The phenomenal world is the world of that you get from integration of sensation, and the noumenal world is the one that you can't get to because it's not the integration of sensation. That distinction is completely destroyed by a correct version or account of perception as detection of what exists and that exists in the one world. All right, I'm going to go on there. If we might come back to that at some point, because it does seem to be worth further discussion. Let's get a start. Let's see, is there something else? The entities receive are metaphysical primaries. We've already discussed that. Entities do not require inferential validation. I agree entirely. All right, why don't we go ahead and get some kind of start, because we wanted to do this, right? Get some kind of start on volition, on free will, which is a different section of the Anteroom. Not totally unrelated, by the way, but different section. Okay, this is page, oops, 54. And the subtitle of the chapter here is The Primary Choice, as the choice to focus or not. Now, it's this interesting idea of the primary choice. I'm going to discuss that in greater depth next time. But anyway, let's go ahead and see what Dr. Peikoff means by that, if we can. Okay, man, according to objectivism, is not moved by factors outside of his control. That is, he's not like a helpless machine controlled by the laws of physics or the psychoanalytic principles of toilet training or of behaviorist conditioning or of Marxist class warfare. These are not the things. Human beings actually have free choice. And he says a course of thought or action is free if it is selected from two or more courses possible under the circumstances. So you have choice if you can do one thing or not do that thing or do something else. In such case, the difference is made by the individual's decision, which did not have to be what it is, that is, which could have been otherwise. That's often taken to be a defining feature of volitional action, is that it could have been otherwise. You chose to think, but you could have not chosen to, you could have chosen not to think, or you could have not chosen to do anything. You could sit there. We'll have to talk about that issue later. To identify the exact locus of human freedom is a difficult task, since it requires one to describe, distinguish complex states of consciousness. That is true. Very few people that I know of in the history of human thought have really correctly described where the exact locus of human freedom is. What is that we have direct control over? What do we have direct control over in our human life? Many people have just said it applies to actions generally. You choose actions. Anyway, it's a difficult thing. I think it has been described before Ayn Rand, even, but we'll come back to that. Before we turn to validate free will, therefore, we must devote considerable space to defining its nature. That's a good idea. So she says consciousness is active. We know that. Man's consciousness must perform a series of actions. Now, when he says, this is the next page, a man's consciousness must perform a complex series of actions, that is using the term consciousness as faculty, not consciousness as awareness. And we have that issue of you have to constantly think about which meaning of the term is being used in a particular area. So I don't like using consciousness that as the faculty. I don't. To me, it causes unnecessary extra mental effort, makes more mental effort required than you really need. But anyway, there is that distinction between consciousness as awareness, consciousness as a faculty, which consciousness as a faculty includes all of the underpinning neurological and bodily functions that create consciousness as well as the awareness itself. Okay.
Lee, do you have an alternative word that might fit better?
Mind, but
well, mind is is another problematic term. Normally, when we speak of a mind, but I'm not sure this is definitive, but we're talking about something that has conceptual ability. But people can't speak of the minds of animals. It's a kind of a extended usage, I would say. So mind is tricky. It's a tricky. Maybe you could use mind there. This is an issue that we run into all the time when we're dealing with consciousness, is we just don't have enough terminology. And that's one of the reasons that we resort frequently to analogies with physical phenomena and things, is we don't have enough terms. And Ayn Rand, notes that fact in the chapter on concepts of consciousness. She points out we don't have enough uh, language. We don't have all the words we need for this. So that's one of the things that needs to be done, and I'm sure Ray is working on it right now. So okay, in other words, I don't know that. I don't have an answer for you on that.
Okay.
What is the better term? Maybe Bob does.
I don't have the same fear of using consciousness for both terms. In fact,
I'm not afraid of it.
In the definition of perception earlier, we talked about what you perceive is the entity, and we also talked about what perception was something that gave you the ability to perceive.
Yeah, and that has problems, I think, that we discussed, but we can discuss it more. This is a more a matter of it's extra work deciding. You have to, in a given context, when the word consciousness is used, you have to decide, are we talking about consciousness as a faculty or consciousness as a state of awareness? And if you're not careful, you might equivocate.
Easy enough decision.
Yeah, but it's unnecessary. Well, anyway, let me go on, but I just think it adds a complexity, and also incentivizes, that's not a good word, motivates equivocation. But let's just go ahead, unless you want to say more about it. It's not a major point here, I guess. Actions of consciousness on the sensory perceptual level are automatic. Well, the perceptual activity is automatic in its neurophysiological aspects, but not in the aspects of directing attention, as I pointed out earlier with like the cocktail party phenomenon. So it's in a way that's true, in a way it's not true. Man's basic freedom of choice, according to objectivism, the basic nature of free will, is to exercise his distinctively human cognitive machinery to set his conceptual faculty in motion. Okay, so this is the basic fundamental nature of human free will in its fullest sense, is setting conceptual faculty in motion. But that doesn't really describe an introspective fact. Well, let's see what Ayn Rand says. She says, to think is an act of choice. Reason does not work automatically. Thinking is not a mechanical process. The connections of logic are not made by instinct. This, by the way, is, of course, Atlas Shrugged, as many of you will recognize. The function of your stomach, lungs, or heart is automatic. The function of your mind is not. Yes. In any hour and issue of your life, you are free to think or to evade that effort. But you're not free to escape from your nature, that reason is your means of survival. Okay. So the question to be or not to be is the question to think or not to think. So it's identifying what the actual locus of perception, not perception, of volition. Now, I think you can go further, if we can go further in introspection and think about cases where you are thinking, actively thinking. What are you actually doing that you can introspect on? Because there's a lot of aspects of thinking you can't. What you're doing is you are exerting the mental effort of attention. That is the introspective signature of volition. As far as in my introspection, whenever I'm exercising volition, I am exerting the mental effort of attention. And that's described very beautifully, actually, by William James in 1900, actually in 1890, but the one I like in 1900 is 1900. Let me read you just a short bit, but this is from William James's Talks to Teachers, a book from 1900. You can get it for free on the net, on the internet, on the web. Talks to Teachers, and there's a subtitle. And this is, I believe, chapter 13. Is that right, Steve? I don't know. I think it's chapter 13. But anyway, let me read from,
but
I think it's later than that. But anyway, James says, this is the chapter on will, anyway. Our moral effort, properly so called, terminates in our holding fast to the appropriate idea. If then you are asked, in what does a moral act consist? When reduced to its simplest and most elementary form, you can make only one reply. You can say that it consists in the effort of attention, by which we hold fast to an idea, but for that effort of attention would be driven out of the mind by the other psychological tendencies that are there. You hold in your mind something and you keep working on it. To think, in short, is the secret of will. And I think that's a pretty good description. He's got a very good introspective description of how, how it works, and how a drunkard can save himself by thinking properly. And anyway, there's some good stuff. I recommend that chapter very strongly. So there is a history of the idea of the choice to think as the basic idea of volition. Now, here's Ayn Rand. And this is probably about the last. We're getting kind of late here, so maybe this is the last thing we can do. I don't know, and we'll see if comments. This is Ayn Rand. My favorite Ayn Rand snippet from unpublished material, published material that she never published in her lifetime, that she did not herself publish. This comes from the Journals of Ayn Rand, and she says, "Values set the psycho-epistemological rhythm or tempo of cognition. They make one hold a given percept or concept in mind long enough to integrate." Holding it, see, get the connection to James there? Long enough to integrate. Integration is what makes a thing or issue real. Thus, non-attention or non-retention is a matter of lack of values, and values have to be connected to action. Here comes an important part. An out-of-focus state may be a state of rushing past everything, psycho-epistemologically, while focus requires slowness. And then she puts a little question mark in parenthesis afterwards. I would erase that question mark myself, but she's thinking aloud here, or thinking on paper here, if you want to use the idea that Jean Maroney uses. Peter Schwartz, here she inserts a question mark in parentheses. Well, I just said that. Okay, that's me. Then she says, Ayn Rand says, think this over. It has many implications, such as the relationship of mental action to existential action, which is true. And James explores those things also. So that an out-of-focus state, rushing past everything. See, what volition does is it slows you down. You're holding on to something by mental effort or attention that otherwise would have disappeared. It slows your thought process down, which is exactly what you need sometimes. Sometimes you're rushing past things too quickly. And
so you can activate more knowledge.
So that you can activate more knowledge. This is going to come up again next week. But yes, exactly. You can activate more knowledge, which you need to do to keep your thinking running properly. And notice, by the way, that this is a exertion of mental effort is not a switch that you flip on and off. There's no such thing as a generic focus switch. I guess we can't really get to that point in detail at this time, but there's no such thing. It is mental effort, and the amount of mental effort you need to exert in a given circumstance depends on the circumstance. You may need to exert more mental effort in one circumstance, less in another, in order to get the clarity that you need. To get that clarity, the amount of mental effort needed is varies. It's not just that you turn some switch on. Oh, I'm in focus. It's an activity, and it takes a certain amount of time, and the amount of time and effort varies with circumstances. I'd better stop there. You guys want to, Bob or Ray or Steve, you want to jump in here at all? Anything you want to before we got some questions.
I got the page number of
good.
The journals. It's page 679.
Good.
And there was a discussion about depth perception and as it being learned. And Gibson rejects depth. There's no depth. It's texture gradients. And so when you look at your feet on the ground, you see texture in the most detailed way. But as you expand and look out into the layout of your environment, the texture the structure becomes more and more dense. And so it's
Yeah, this is something we'd have to show a picture, I think, Steve. It's really hard to,
right. I just
one of
wanted
those
to
things,
give a quick.
but you might have that picture. You might have that somewhere.
So
I don't
why are
right
we
now.
going to perception again right now?
Oh, I don't know. Steve wanted to make an extra point about it. It's
Just
not, it's not part of our.
depth. Depth is an invalid
Oh,
term.
it's also
for-
in there. Okay. Yeah. Well, that is another matter. That's a different matter we can discuss. We can come back to that. So where we are is where Dr. Peikoff is about to introduce the concept of focus with a visual analogy. And I definitely want to discuss that because that visual analogy needs some serious unpacking to be done next week. And next week also, he's going to describe here which we haven't quite got to, a two-stage process of volition. Primary choice followed by secondary choice, one followed by the others. I will argue next time that volition is more like a vector. It is a single choice with two integrated, inseparable aspects, a magnitude and a direction. They go together. You don't first have a magnitude and then have a direction. It doesn't work that way. So that's for next week.
Terrific.
Terrific.
Sounds terrific.
So thanks for
Anything else you guys want to do before we wrap up here?
If we can close, this isn't something to discuss now, but it is something that piqued my interest, and this is something I hope we can integrate into our discussion next week. For the new intellectual, on page 9 in the hardcover, Ayn writes, "The preconceptual level of consciousness is non-volitional." Set that aside. And this is what struck me. Volition begins with the first syllogism. Volition begins with the first syllogism. So I'm curious to talk about that next week, what you think about that. Okay?
Okay, we can do something with that. I mean, this is I'm tempted to say this is something of a rhetorical flourish.
Okay.
On her part, but maybe that's not right. We'll see what Bob may want to, we'll see. Okay, we'll get that. We'll get that next time. In the meantime, maybe we can do it a little bit now because we are about to, as Daniel reminded me, we're about to open a Zoom room. Daniel, do we have well, it's for you guys, it's the same room, right? But did you post, Daniel, did you give the people, the unseen audience out there, the address of the Zoom room?
I will as soon as we wrap up.
Okay, we're wrapping up.
Yeah, we don't want any
So go ahead. Yeah,
drive by.
Go ahead and do it.
Zoom. Okay, so
go ahead.
thank the audience for coming and thanks for your.
Sorry, I got to call a quick timeout. Anything in the chat that we ought to take?
That's what I was saying. Yeah, there's I gave the depth perception, and then there's some vague questions that I couldn't make out. But if we slow down in the Zoom room, we can check these out.
Well, what do you mean you can't make them out? I don't understand what you mean by that.
They were too abstract for me to process. Well, I was.
Could you just give me an example?
You
No,
can't perceive them?
No.
You can't?
No.
Well, I have to look for myself. All right, please come to the Zoom room then, and we'll deal with it. I guess is what's going to happen. Okay, gentlemen, I'm going off to. Oh no, we those of us who are going just have to stay.